Hello and welcome to our Week 3 supplemental lecture on Albert Hirschman's rival interpretations of market society. Hirschman's going to go through what he regards as some contradictory conceptions of market society, capitalism, in order to try to work out what the most persuasive theory might be about capitalism's impact on our social bonds. We talked about this a little bit in one of our common lectures this week, looking at people worrying about the division of labor and the implication of the division of labor for social cohesion. Hirschman's going to run through some of these theories as well, and come up with a sort of surprising answer at the end. Okay. So he starts, and it's a very cute introduction. He talks about the goal of perfecting society as something that is a new goal. He says there's a historical shift from regarding unhappiness, sort of circumstances that happen to you that are bad, as being the result of chance or the will of God, something that's fundamentally outside your control, and so you can complain about it, but there's nothing you can actively do about it. It's not resented in the way that we resent something that we think someone else is doing to us. There's a shift to the idea that unhappiness is due to changeable dimensions of the social environment. He talks about this line that he quotes from someone at the time this change is taking place, saying that, as though happiness itself had been recently discovered in Europe. And he says you have two different enlightenments. People will often describe a Scottish Enlightenment and a French Enlightenment, and they have sort of different moods, but happen around the same historical period. And you have an idea of social engineering, he says, that he associates with the French side of the Enlightenment, that arises in tandem with the idea of unintended consequences of human actions that he associates more with the Scottish Enlightenment. He says that these two things don't combine in the way that we think they might from our current day perspective. So when we think of unintended consequences, we tend to think of negative consequences that people didn't mean that arise from human behavior. But he said at the time these concepts weren't linked that way. It wasn't that you had a notion of social engineering and it was accompanied by a critique of the possible negative consequences of that engineering. Instead, what you had were people talking about the possibility to engineer a better, a happier, a more productive, a more wealthy, a more leisurely society. And then you also had people, and we looked at Adam Smith a bit in this regard in our lecture this week, who talked about the unintended consequences of human behavior generating good unintended consequences. So the fact that someone pursuing their own interests in the market could actually generate a kind of socially beneficial effect or social harmony, even though they weren't seeking to do that. But he says it doesn't take long historically before the concept of social perfectibility gets adapted into critiques of capitalism, where capitalism is perceived to not be the perfect society. We think we can do better. And so these early discourses about social perfectibility get aimed at capitalism quite quickly. He talks about a very long discourse that lasts for several hundred years, the idea that trade is a civilizing force. And you can see sort of the remnants of this, or a preoccupation with it, in some of the materials that Foucault is looking at this week as well. There's some other authors that we don't get to in the course that talk about this. The most prominent one is Norbert Elias in a work called The Civilizing Process. That's worth a look if you're particularly interested in the development of manners. But Hirschman talks about in the 16th through 18th centuries you have an expectation that if you develop and expand commerce, it's going to provide a force for peace, because states will be bound together, the interests of one state will be bound together with the interests of its trading partners, and so why would you wage war? We'll run into this idea in a more recent form later in the term when we look at Francis Fukuyama's argument about the end of history. Trade was also expected to impact the internal manners of citizens of a state. Feudal manners were presented as quite crude and unrefined and unpredictable and violent, and again you can see some of this in the contrast that Foucault draws in the reading this week. And there was the expectation that trade would increase people's wealth, but also inculcate a certain refinement and gentleness, gentility in how they behave. Okay, so it will encourage, Hirschman says, the development of a better type of person, and he's summarizing people writing at the time, more honest, reliable, orderly, and disciplined, as well as more friendly and helpful, ever ready to find solutions to conflicts and a middle ground for opposed opinions. Okay, so the fact that your interests are so bound together with the interests of so many other people that you're engaged regularly in trade and commerce and in the compromises that are required for those, it will have a general civilizing effect. And this emphasis on discipline is something worth thinking about in relation to the Foucault piece this week, if that's one of the things that you've read. Foucault focuses on the development of a self-discipline as a historical shift as well. And there's a perception that there's a danger to capitalism posed by the crude and rough manners that were encouraged by feudalism. So there's a threat, and maybe or maybe not, capitalism will be able to overcome that. Okay, then he moves into criticism. So those were hopes for capitalism. That's one of the early discourses. Then he goes into fears about it. Is it going to be something that is going to have negative impacts? And the primary theory that he talks about here is the notion that capitalism is a self-destructive force. So it starts off as a force that is destructive of previous forms of society. But the fear here is that it's going to turn that destructive power on itself and undermine itself. And if you take a look at the Schumpeter from this week, you'll see a version of that argument, and Hirschman talks about Schumpeter in this piece as well. He starts with a fairly recent critical piece from the 70s that expresses the market as a force that undermines values, that it emphasizes self-interest, and that it requires forms of rationalism that tend to undermine religious belief. And so we lose the basis of our kind of common social bonds as a result of this. He says that there's some ways that this argument can be dated back to Marx and Engels in something they write in the Communist Manifesto that is in fact almost something you can see as a positive reaction to capitalism from their point of view. They talk about how it explodes older forms of society. They don't view those older forms of society positively. So the idea that capitalism is particularly corrosive of the social values of feudalism isn't a problem for them, but it introduces a discourse of capitalism as a dynamic, restless, corrosive thing that keeps blasting through all boundaries. And Hirschman says that once capitalism is visualized as a kind of a relentless, blind juggernaut that just sort of rolls forward through history, trammeling everything in its wake, the view can arise that it might undermine itself, that it might not stop at things that are non-capitalist, it might not be able to prevent itself from undermining values on which it itself relies. And one of the arguments Hirschman mentions is the idea that frugality is required for capitalism, and yet, because capitalism generates so much wealth, it becomes sort of psychologically and culturally difficult over time to sustain that kind of frugal motive. We'll run into this again, actually, from Keynes, when we talk about economic systems. And Keynes worries about the transition to the 20th century losing values on which capitalism relied. Hirschman also talks about a position that says that capitalism relied more on those earlier value systems than it admits. And so in attacking non-capitalist or pre-capitalist forms of society, it undermines its own basis. And he associates this position with Schumpeter and Horkheimer. I think it's more fairly associated with Horkheimer than with Schumpeter, but he talks about them both. He also gives a possible historical basis for the rise of this belief in capitalism as self-destructive. He says basically that there had always been a lot of destruction on the periphery. These areas, though, were far enough away that many of the theorists of capitalism didn't need to confront them, or when they did, viewed them as non-capitalist rather than as parts of a complicated, internally differentiated world capitalist system. And Hirschman says, with the Industrial Revolution, the havoc came home. Okay, so the violent character of the economic system was no longer something that you could bracket off as something that occurs to people other than the people that you know. It's something that penetrated the industrial core, and it shaped a conception of capitalism as destructive that then sort of formed into a discourse of it being self-destructive. And he talks a little bit here about sociology and economics as professions, and talks about some of the figures that we discuss here and some that will come up later in the term. So he talks about Durkheim and another sociologist we're not reading for this course, Zimmel, and the fact that both of them have an ambivalent conception of the division of labor and the market as, on the one hand, supposedly creating complex new forms of social bond that can bind people together, but also threatening to undermine them. And we've talked a little bit in the common lecture this week about how Durkheim thinks about that. And then he talks about American sociology, which he says focuses just on institutions other than the market, by and large, as the basis of social cohesion. So the market is strangely treated as though it is a purely economic space, and then they look for other kinds of institutions and interactions, either face-to-face or larger-scale institutions, as the basis for cohesion. And then he says that economics has a very interesting history in this, because it would seem well poised to make an argument about the market as a force of cohesion, because it had been making that kind of argument in the 18th century. But he says that argument had come to be tied very closely to the position that the market has the properties it has because perfect competition exists. And as we move forward through the 20th century, that began to seem less and less defensible. It did not look like the economies that we actually had were performing in any kind of state of perfect competition. Schumpeter, in the reading from him this week, is actually going to debate this. He doesn't agree with that verdict. But Hirschman is right that this probably was the mainstream view. Okay, and Schumpeter's view is an outlier, was at the time, and probably still is today. But because perfect competition didn't seem to describe what was going on, the older arguments for why the market would be a force for cohesion didn't seem to apply. And it's only with the development of a different kind of economics over the course of the 20th century that you start getting economists again trying to say something about the binding force that is available within markets. And then Hirschman says, look, perversely, you've got this discourse, this very prominent discourse about capitalism being so strong and so unstoppable that it's going to undermine itself. But at the same time, you get a discourse that presents capitalism as being just too weak to overcome pre-capitalist forms. And Hirschman is sort of amused by the fact that you get these two things running alongside each other, with the adherents of one largely not engaging with the adherents of the other, and he thinks this is a problem, that, your theory should try to be aware of other theories in its own time and figure out how you relate to them and what you can do with each other. He calls this the feudal shackles thesis. And the idea is that capitalism tries to develop, it starts to develop, but older forms still have substantial influence and power. And the bourgeois class, the people who are driving capitalism forward, are timid in the face of this influence and power, and they try to conform to it, and they accept more limited positions socially and economically than they might otherwise. He says that this has an interesting implication, that if only capitalism could have been allowed to develop fully, social bonds would have been more secure. He says it's actually kind of the inheritor, in a silent way, of the old position that capitalism would have been good for social cohesion, it would have been good for peace, it would have been good for manners. But it's that argument, he says, turned on its head, it's stated in reverse. He says that this argument also is implied in Marx in a different work, so where the capitalism as the boundless, blind juggernaut is part of the Communist Manifesto that Marx writes with Engels. He says this idea that capitalism is kind of too weak to overcome pre-capitalist forms comes up in the introduction to Capital, in a discussion about the contrast between England and Germany, where Marx takes England to be a place where capitalism is being allowed to develop more fully, and Germany is a place where it's shackled by German historical institutions. So Marx analyzes a process there of other institutions, non-capitalist institutions, being able to sort of hold back the full development of capitalism. This is an aside, and I don't actually think it's part of Marx's analysis, but Hirschman's point is that it gets into the discourse in a broader sense from this sort of fleeting reference in Capital. So Hirschman says, in other words, the trouble with capitalism suddenly is not that it's so strong as to be self-destructing, but that it's too weak to play the progressive role history is supposedly assigned to it. And he notes, and this will be accurate, that this notion that capitalism is too weak arises mainly with reference to discussions of the periphery, although he does trace that it slowly spreads into the analyses of core capitalist states as you move forward in the 20th century. He describes Schumpeter as a strong advocate of this thesis, and says Schumpeter, ironically, is also a strong advocate of the self-destruction thesis in different works at different times. And he finds it strange that Schumpeter should thereby echo Marx. As I say in the talk on Schumpeter this week, actually Schumpeter is an extremely close and careful reader of Marx, so it shouldn't be that surprising if Schumpeter ends up replicating things that Marx also says. Hirschman doesn't seem to be aware of that connection. Okay? And we'll see this argument again later in the term when we talk about theories of development, because it is quite a prominent one in analyses of what's going on with the economies of developing countries. And then Hirschman comes to this idea of American exceptionalism, and he says for a long period it was viewed as a huge advantage for the US, that it had no feudal past, that capitalism could do what it wanted, that you didn't have to wrestle with the problems of legacies of historical institutions that would get in the way of the fully modern institutions. It was taken as an exemplar of capitalist development left unimpeded and of political pluralism. And I talk a little bit about pluralism in relation to the Berlin article this week under the political readings. Okay? And these things, this sort of freedom of political and economic development, the lack of the need to worry about a feudal past, are taken to have something to do with the US's success in the 20th century. However, he points out that there's a strain of thought that he regards as becoming more prominent at the time he's writing, that actually criticizes the US because it lacks the internal diversity that would have been provided had there been remnants of a pre-capitalist social formation. And it's accused of having a kind of internal absolutism about it that Europe supposedly doesn't have, because it has this internal lumpiness, this internal complexity. It's an argument that Hirschman says is also extended to the Latin American countries that have a similar kind of relationship. He calls this the feudal blessings thesis, that the countries are particularly privileged if they've got these contradictory or different social formations that are kind of warring internally within them, because it provides internal diversity. And then he gets to the heart of the piece, just in the last few pages. What do we do with this pile of contradictory theories? We've got various things that are supposed to be wrong with capitalism. There are ways to criticize each of those things. Is one of them defensible? Is one of them better than the others? And he says, actually, combinations of the various theories might be more accurate and more plausible than trying to assert any one of the theories by itself. And again, this isn't miles away from the sort of argument that Berlin is making in his advocacy of political pluralism in the article that he writes this week. So Hirschman combines the theories that he's been discussing, and he says, look, isn't it plausible to say that feudalism can be both a hindrance to the full development of capitalism and contribute something valuable to the resulting society? As in, there's no reason it has to be one or the other. It can easily be both, and in fact, it kind of on its face sounds more likely that it would be both. And similarly, he says capitalism can be both self-undermining and self-reinforcing. It can generate empathy for other people, and it can spread values of calculation and instrumental reason and self-interest that can undermine that empathy. And doesn't that seem more likely than that it would only do one or the other? And he says, once this view is adopted, the moral basis of capitalist society will be seen as being constantly depleted and replenished at the same time. An excess of depletion over replenishment, and a consequent crisis of the system, is then of course possible. But the special circumstances making for it would have to be noted. So it's not inevitable that capitalism would generate some kind of crisis of cohesion, crisis of values. It's possible, and we can understand why it would be possible, and then we can explore the situations in which it would become likely, rather than just possible. He says, just as it might be possible to specify conditions under which the system would gain in cohesion and legitimacy. And then he ends on something that connects quite well to the Schumpeter reading also. Both of them are quite critical of the idea that what social science is meant to do is to make a prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. Hirschman says, after so many failed prophecies, okay, every theory that he's analyzed in here was a prophecy about what was about to happen in the future. None of the prophecies have come true. After so many failed prophecies, is it not in the interest of social science to embrace complexity, be it at some sacrifice of its claim to predictive power? Okay? There's a humility that emerges from theories in the 20th century, and Schumpeter reflects this, Hirschman reflects this. We'll run into it again and again on the course of the term. There were a lot of linear theories of social development that made strong predictions about the direction development was going to progress. And by the mid-20th century, none of those theories is holding up very well. And so you get a flourishing of a particular kind of theory that is somewhat skeptical of our ability to make these kinds of predictions, and advocating more modest forms of analytical claims, and these theories are examples of that. And we'll talk about this again as we go forward.